Racial Restrictive Covenant project. And I'm very excited to be able to hear from that team, Jaslyn Woods, Aaron Miller, and Samantha Cutts. So really eager to hear from all of you momentarily, really to hear about this history of racial restrictive covenants and present some of the actionable steps that we can be taking today to sort of learn more about this history. And while this presentation may be focusing on some of these more modern concepts of deeds and properties and the language that's used, I think that it's really important that we all remember that this history of restricting people and this history of discrimination, especially around land, is something that exists here and has existed for a very long period of time. And specifically within our area, of course, we need to think about the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and other Coast Salish and indigenous groups that have been affected by that restriction to the land that they have protected and been on since time immemorial. Of course, we have a lot of people within those communities today that are working really hard to continue that care and that preservation. But as we think about these more modern concepts of deeds and properties, it's also important to relate ourselves to these historical realities as well, of the ways that people, and specifically indigenous people in this area, have been restricted to that land. So with all of these in mind, again, I'm incredibly excited to hear more from the University of Washington's Racial Restrictive Covenant team. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Jaslyn.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to take this time to share my screen. Okay, so my name is Jaslyn Woods, and I'm a senior research associate for the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project at the University of Washington. And I'm here with my colleagues, Aaron Miller and Sam Cutts, and they are also research associates with our project. And I'm going to give a quick little agenda of how the first part of this presentation is going to go. Sam's going to start us off by defining what racial restrictive covenants are, and then give some details about our project. And then she'll talk about some of the broader tools of segregation that were implemented and encouraged by the federal government. And then Aaron will focus a little bit more on the context of King County and Seattle, and talk about Seattle's segregation story in King County more broadly. And then we'll go into how segregation was enforced, and then the end of racial restrictive covenants when they became illegal. And then we'll talk about the legacy of segregation tools more broadly. And then we'll have a time for questions. And then we'll go into our Zoomers transcription session, which gives you all a direct way to contribute to our project and help us find and transcribe the use of racial restrictive covenants in Washington state. And so if you do have questions as we are talking, feel free to type them in the chat, but just know that we're not going to address any questions until that designated time for questions after the legacy portion of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Hello, everyone. Hope you guys are all doing good on this Tuesday night.
Already messed it up. Okay, we're going.
Wait, give me one second to get my screen all set up again. Love virtual presentations. All right. So we're going to jump in first and define restrictive covenants first thing today. So racial restrictive covenants are agreements entered into by a group of property owners or a seller in a given neighborhood, which legally binds them not to sell, lease, or rent their property to specified racial or religious groups. And these were legally binding clauses in deeds and other property records. So all what you see on the screen here are all examples of restrictive covenants, and each of them was taken from property records in King County. And we're going to go into depth on a few of these later on in some of the language, but these were extremely explicit covenants that explicitly denied a property to a racial group. All right, so our project, we're the Restrictive Covenants Project. This project began in 2005, but was unable to be completed because of a lack of funding. However, last year, the state legislature passed and signed State House Bill 1335 in March of 2021 to fund this project. And ever since, we have been tasked with identifying racist deed restrictions and covenants and property records in counties across the entire state of Washington. All right, so this is our map. of King County right now. To date, we have identified 20,000 of those restrictions I talked about earlier in King County, nearly 4,000 in Pierce, and the work will be continued in other counties across the state as well. If you want to explore our map, I will drop a link in the chat real quick. Give me 1 second. All right, that should be in the chat now. So the red circles on this map indicate that restrictions we have found thus far in deeds, and the yellow indicates restrictions advertised in newspapers. It was common for subdivisions to be advertised as restricted as code for white only, but those yellow circles say we have not yet found the property records. And this map really shows the geography of where restrictions and restrictive covenants were used. It partly affects the timing of development as well. Areas that were newly subdivided between 1926 and 1952 were the most likely to be restricted in their deeds because it was easy for developers to put restrictions on new subdivisions rather than already existing neighborhoods. And these restrictions would then apply to all properties and all future owners in perpetuity. One thing you will see here is that we haven't found many restrictions on the east side. This is largely because the east side remained undeveloped for a long time, especially in that 1926 to 1952 window. So in like the 1950s, Bellevue only had a population of 6,600 people and only 32 of them were Black. That being said, this map is incomplete and our research is still ongoing, and many areas that appear to be unrestricted may have been, or they may not have, may have had restrictions, or they may not. But even then, they could have been restricted by other means and segregated by other means as well. All right, so the real estate industry directly contributed to segregation and was responsible for these racial restrictive covenants. Until 1950, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had a clause in their code of ethics against selling homes to a person of color because it would be destructive to the property values of the neighborhood. Most banks, loan companies, title companies, insurance companies, and real estate men were closely affiliated with the real estate board and upheld their code of ethics. Almost all of the Seattle real estate men were members of the National Association and upheld their code of ethics. Nice. 1 second. All right, racial restrictive covenants are not the same as redlining, but it's also important to note how vital the federal government was in implementing segregation. During the New Deal era, which paralleled the era of private restriction, the federal government stated several different racially restrictive housing efforts including racialized public housing, the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Federal Housing Administration. Millions lost home in the Great Depression, and the housing industry collapsed along with the lending industry. First with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and then with the Federal Housing Administration, the feds rescued homeowners by providing new mortgages to existing homeowners and encouraging new lending on long-term mortgages backed by FHA insurance. These measures over time turned the US into a homeowners nation, or rather a nation where most white families owned homes. The famous redlining maps are part of this process. The HOLC produced them in 1936 in order to advise mortgage lenders where their investments would be safe and where they would not be. Hazardous neighborhoods were coded red, declining neighborhoods in yellow, and neighborhoods where Black or Asian people lived was mostly red, or all red. The FHA followed up by refusing to underwrite mortgages in such neighborhoods and typically denying insurance to families of color. Beginning in the 1920s and continuing through the next 3 decades, the real estate industry's efforts paralleled that of federal government by implementing things like racial restrictive covenants and housing discrimination to further solidify segregation. The big distinction here is that redlining was a practice of the federal government, while racial restrictive covenants were a practice of the real estate industry, but enabled by the federal government. I'm now going to hand it off to Erin, who will discuss King County's long history of racial exclusion.
Hello, everyone. I'm Erin. So now we're going to transition to focusing on racial segregation in King County and Seattle. So Seattle has a long history of racial discrimination and segregation. For many generations, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Native Americans were shut out of neighborhoods, schools, many occupations, and sometimes stores and restaurants. Seattle and King County still show the effects of this history. In the late 1800s, Indigenous Americans were banned from the city of Seattle, despite the fact that Seattle is located on traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. Chinese people were also driven out of Seattle in 1886 And those that returned were expected to live in Chinatown or work as servants in the home of wealthy whites. So the map on the right here shows where most non-white people lived during the 1940s in Seattle. As you can see, non-white people were heavily concentrated to certain areas, and this is indicated by the color red on the map, showing the extent to which the county was segregated. And although many assume that the Pacific Northwest was immune to segregation, like that of Jim Crow in the South, it is important to acknowledge that the Pacific Northwest practiced active racial discrimination for a very long time. In most Southern states, segregation of schools, buses, restaurants, and public facilities was required by law. And although this wasn't the case in Washington state, local government agencies supported discrimination and segregation in various ways, including the certification of racial restrictive covenants and encouraging police to harass Black individuals seen in white neighborhoods. And Seattle's segregation practices extended beyond housing. Black and Asian Americans were often denied service in bars, restaurants, barbershops, and even hospitals. This here is a picture of Coon Chicken Inn, a restaurant which was located in Lake City until the 1950s. Patrons entered in through the mouth of a man showed at the front of the establishment. This restaurant illustrates the prevalence of racism and racial discrimination in King County, and that it is important that we stray away from the narrative that overt forms of racism were just a thing of the South. Because as we've mentioned, white people in the Pacific Northwest practice active and explicit racial discrimination. So given Seattle's restrictive history, racial restrictive covenants were put into place by many sellers and within many neighborhoods. An example of a prominent Seattle resident that often bought and restricted subdivisions is William Boeing, which most of you might know, the founder of Boeing Aircraft, the world's largest aerospace company and manufacturer of commercial planes. He and his wife Bertha purchased large tracts of land in what is now Northwest Seattle and Shoreline. All of his subdivisions were restricted to only people that were white or Caucasian. To demonstrate the extent to which he restricted property, in just 4 subdivisions alone, the Boeings restricted a total of 960 properties to white people only. At least 3 Boeing subdivisions were located in Shoreline. These subdivisions, which you may have heard, are Innis Arden, Park View, and Northwood Park. It was more complicated to impose restrictions on older neighborhoods, and as a result of this, sometimes neighborhood associations organized petition campaigns to convince fellow residents to bind their property with a racial covenant. One of the best documented efforts of this restricted most blocks in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Starting in 1927, the Capitol Hill Community Club organized a 3-year campaign during which 964 property owners signed petition covenants restricting 183 blocks and ultimately 958 lots of property from Black people. So now we are going to look at some restrictions that we have found from properties in King County that have interesting terminology. So this restriction is for Lake Washington Garden Tracts, which is on the east side. It stated that the property could not be sold, leased, or occupied by anyone not of the Aryan race. This is language that was used by Hitler, and the timing of this is especially interesting because World War II had already ended at the point that this restriction was put into place. So another one, Ladd's second edition in Jefferson Park, located in Seattle, stated that only white people could live there except in the circumstance of a domestic servant living in the home of their master. And this one is interesting because it has very clear slavery connotations in its language, and this is in 1927. This all alludes to how white people were thinking of non-white people at this time. So Sheridan Heights, located in Lake Forest Park, stated that the property shall not be sold to anyone of any Asiatic, Negro, Hawaiian, or Malay race. Lastly, McMicken Heights number 2 in SeaTac stated that no part of the property was to ever be used or occupied by anyone that was Hebrew, Ethiopian, Malay, or of the Asiatic race. And this all just goes to show the extent to which people of color and Jewish people were restricted from many properties in King County. So Shoreline specifically has many restrictions as well. Many of the restrictions make sure to exclude anyone that was not of the white or Caucasian race, as you can see here. And you can take a second to read over some of the restrictions that are placed in this area. And again, this all just shows the extent to which white people covered all their bases to make it very clear that if you were not white, you were not welcome in many neighborhoods and parts of King County.
All right, so even though the use of restrictive covenants was prevalent, they were not the most powerful tools of segregation, and the fact that we have found few or none in some neighborhoods means very little. Social means like violence, harassment, and the actions of realtors were the large focus in keeping certain racial and religious groups of people out of certain areas. This social enforcement was often handled by real estate agents who blocked access and by angry white neighbors and community members who harassed and threatened. And if that failed, then real violence followed. For instance, an instance of this is the bombing of the home of Carl Brooks and his family in Shoreline. After Carl Brooks, a civil rights activist, and his family moved into the restricted neighborhood of Lago Vista, their family was harassed, and after these actions did not cause the Brooks family to leave, race terrorists threw a dynamite bomb into their home, shattering windows and endangering the lives of their 2 sleeping children. This act of terror was not even reported in major daily newspapers, but only reported in this left-wing weekly newspaper. The fact that this explicit act of racially motivated terror was ignored by the major media of the time indicates the pervasive and unanimous consensus of segregation among the institutions of power. This article on the left of the slide states that the sheriff's office at the time condoned the campaign of intimidation that preceded the dynamite throwing. This is a prime example of sundown zone or town law enforcement. Until the late 1960s, Seattle and other police forces in King County enforced informal sundown rules and zones. In the evenings after work, African Americans were not supposed to be in white neighborhoods, and they would often be stopped, questioned, and harassed if they were seen in one. These sundown zones highlighted the social enforcement that accompanied or acted as a substitute for the use of racial restrictive covenants to ensure the segregation of King County and demonstrate how practices of social enforcement were often allowed to continue and are often supported by those in power. All right, now I'm going to talk about the end of restrictive covenants. In 1948, in the landmark Shelley v. Kramer Supreme Court case, they ruled that restrictive covenants and property deeds violated the equal protection provision of the 14th Amendment. However, it did not become legally enforceable, and the misconception that it changed everything is not true. The ruling did very little. New restrictions were added to subdivisions and recorded by county auditors well into the 1950s. And as before, segregation was enforced by other means. Recently, we have covenants in the early 60s in Snohomish and Pierce County. In 1964, after 40 cities had already passed laws banning discrimination in housing, Seattle citizens voted against the measure 2-1. Here is a newspaper ad paid for by the real estate industry, claiming that the proposed law violated property rights. It is important to note that this decision was made in the midst of a nationwide struggle for civil rights. Things didn't really change until the Fair Housing Act. In 1968, in the wake of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, and since then, discrimination has been prohibited. The legislature followed up in 1969, voiding discriminatory provisions in real estate contracts. But just to emphasize how little changed in the 20 years after Shelley, here is an incident of housing terror that took place in the area near the University of Washington in 1958. Marion West, who was white, was able to buy a small rooming house with her husband, Ray, who was Black. They rented rooms to students of color who otherwise found it hard to find housing in the area. But after years of harassment, including a cross burning on their lawn, they gave up and moved away. I'm going to hand this back over to Aaron, who's going to begin talking about the legacy and aftermath of these restrictions.
Okay, so really not that much has changed even after 1968. And it wasn't until 1980 that we can begin to see a process of desegregation. But even now, with the most recent census data, the story is complicated. Sam will drop a link to these interactive maps in the chat, and you can follow the changes decade by decade since 1940. This is the Asian American distribution in Seattle and North King County. These maps show the changing residential patterns for people of various Asian ancestries. I don't have time to explore them, but it is important to understand that there are multiple factors at work here. Massive immigration has transformed Asian American populations since 1980. These tell a story about population growth. Immigration from all parts of Asia has tripled and quadrupled the Asian and Asian American population here in King County, while the African American population in King County has grown very slowly. By 2020, Asian Americans are also living in all parts of King County for the most part. Even though there has been process in desegregating Seattle and North King County, it has been different for various racial groups. These are also, if at any point you feel I'm speaking too fast, you need me to slow down, just feel free to even unmute yourself and let me know, because I know it's a lot of information at one time. Okay, so these maps are the African American residential distribution maps of 1960, 1980, and 2020. Unlike the large increase in population growth from immigration of people of Asian descent, the African American population in King County has grown slowly. Additionally, you can see that Black Americans are mostly moving south rather than east, north, or west, being pushed and priced out of Seattle. The Central District has been a target of gentrification in recent years. This is good for homeowners looking to sell, but bad for almost all renters. So many Black individuals have been forced out of their homes in the CD. North Seattle still remains 75% white. 58% of Black or white families would have to move to achieve full integration. Overall, desegregation has been very slow and unevenly distributed across different racial groups. So this history largely matters because of the wealth effect of yesterday's segregation. Homeownership is the main way that Americans build family wealth. Segregation suppressed homeownership and wealth building opportunities for people of color who had trouble buying homes, and those who did manage to buy homes usually paid artificially high prices. Even though racial restrictive covenants and housing discrimination are now technically illegal, Black families still are less likely to own homes, and their homes are worth less on average than white families who have been accumulating real estate wealth for generations. Across income levels today, white families are twice as likely to own a home as Black families in Washington. This graph depicts the white and Black homeownership rates by family income in Washington state from 2016 to 2020 based on census data. As you can see here, Black home ownership rates are lower than white rates at all income levels, especially among families earning less than $75,000. Nearly 47% of white residents of Washington who make less than $50,000 a year are homeowners. If you consider the rising cost of homes, this illustrates how multi-generational wealth building through home ownership has worked. People who were not able to buy homes historically have missed a huge opportunity to build wealth. We should also note that home ownership rates have declined dramatically for Black families, especially for incomes under $75,000. 10 years ago, 52% of Black families in that income category owned a home. That dropped to 30% in the recent census. White rates have also declined, and this no doubt reflects the huge increase in home prices that we have been seeing recently.
Okay, let's turn our attention to education. If we think back to the redlining map created by the HOLC, schools like Franklin High School and Rainier Beach were in areas that the HOLC deemed declining, while Chief South and Garfield were in hazardous areas. To this day, the schools in these areas, in the areas that were redlined or segregated, still disproportionately serve students of color. I want to turn our attention to the graph on the right, which shows PTA money in Seattle. PTA money is an interesting way to look at inequity in Seattle public schools. Seattle is a city that is 60% white. The bottom 3 high schools with $0 in PTA money are the schools that serve most of the students of color in Seattle. Rainier Beach is 95% students of color. Franklin High School is 91% students of color. Chief South is nearly 80% students of color. While the school with the most money, Roosevelt, with $3.5 million in PTA money, is 70% white. This is significant because in an era where our schools are so underfunded, PTA money buys extra staff, technology, course materials, tutoring, and funds extracurriculars, new uniforms for sports, and supports college preparation. PTA money is just one of the ways the legacy of segregation and housing discrimination continue to impact education and many other facets of life.
Okay, so we also see the impacts of residential segregation and public health. Research shows that life expectancy is lower for redline communities. There are higher rates of poverty, diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, and pulmonary disease. In Seattle specifically, redline neighborhoods have the most infant deaths per year, lowest life expectancy, and highest rates of low birth weight infants. Historically, redline areas consistently have higher levels of air pollution than areas that were deemed desirable or best by the HOLC. People who live in these historically redlined areas also deal with environmental hazards like higher temperatures and less access to green spaces, which has a negative impact on their health and overall well-being. So, what can we do now? That is the big question. So I'm going to transition into talking a little bit about what homeowners can do if their property does contain a restrictive covenant. So homeowners have options if their house deed contains a restrictive covenant. You can file a restrictive covenant modification form, have the covenant moved through the superior courts, or do nothing. You technically don't have to do anything if your home has a restriction in it, because these restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. But we do encourage homeowners to file a restrictive covenant modification form rather than simply removing the covenant. This is because doing so denounces the racial restriction. It acts like an amendment, and it's a document that's just attached to the deed containing the racially restrictive language. This denounces the behavior without erasing the history. We believe as a project that it is important not to erase the history of these racial restrictive covenants, because they are a historical reminder of the segregationist systems that have mapped the greater Seattle area historically, and in many ways continue to do so and affect our lives today.
So now just a quick recap. First, racial restrictive covenants are distinct from redlining, but both are tools of segregation. Racial restrictive covenants refer to contract language in deeds that state that no person of certain racial groups can live or occupy a certain property. Redlining refers to maps created by the federal program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, to advise mortgage lenders where their investments would be safe and where they would not be, resulting in mortgages being given out to white people in white neighborhoods and not being given out, or given out much less and with much higher interest rates, to people of color in non-white neighborhoods. 2, King County has a prevalent history of segregation and exclusion, and this is something that the Pacific Northwest residents need to confront and reckon with. 3, covenants were widely used in King County and Washington State, but were not the only means of enforcing segregation. Social enforcement played a large role in keeping non-white people out of certain neighborhoods. And the legacy of racial restrictive covenants and other means of housing segregation still impact our communities, as we discussed in regards to wealth accumulation, education, and public health. And lastly, this is going to be a quick transition into our next phase. We need your help with Zooniverse, which is an online platform we're going to talk about after we have a quick break for questions.
And so with that, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Or let me look at the chat as well.
So to what extent have covenants been removed?
From what there's every once in a while when we go through these documents, we find waivers of restrictions. I found a few of those. So that means that homeowners have individually gone in and like removed them or denounced them like from their deeds. But I don't know, Jaslyn or Aaron might be able to answer this, but I don't know if there's been this like large movement to
there hasn't really been a large movement to remove them. Washington is unique in the sense that they offer a restrictive covenant modification form, which allows homeowners to denounce the language. But if you want to remove the language, you have to file like a notion with the Superior Court and get a lawyer and go to court and remove it. And I know in other states that have covenants, there's no option to denounce, you just have to go to court and remove. And it's all on like the individual homeowner level. But these restrictions, they're still in the property records, if that's what you're asking. Is that what you're asking, Pete?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. Does the project look at plat restrictions as well as deed restrictions?
Yes. The first thing we do when we start a new county is we look at every single plat the county has recorded. We record in a database if in the plat they have the restriction, and then from there we look at the deeds and the other types of property records.
Yeah, and one of the biggest things that we are looking for is the entirety of the plat, as opposed to some restrictions will just be on a certain lot or block within a plat. Whereas we will find deeds where the entire plat is restricted under that covenant.
Yes, from a research standpoint, it's much easier to find a restriction. Like, it's easier for us if we find a restriction for a whole plat, because then we know that that whole area is restricted, rather than when we find a deed that just has a restriction for one lot in a block. It's harder for us to figure out if that whole area was restricted or if that just one singular homeowner decided to restrict.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I was having a problem with my sound earlier. My name is Winona Hollins-Haig, and I'm the 32nd District Rep for Ennis-Arden. I've been living here for 44 years. I'm in an interracial marriage, and my husband actually built our home here. I am aware, and I think maybe you guys are too, that there was a big article in the Seattle Times about Ennis-Arden and our restrictive covenants at one point in time. And it was, I think they interviewed my neighbors. I know they had some quotes from the Joiners, Paris and Carla Joyner, who said they would not have moved here if they really had known this level of discrimination that was happening in this area. Now, I brought this up at one of our Ennis-Arden club meetings few years back, after the article, before the article, I think it was actually before the article, and was told that, oh, well, this isn't enforceable. So, no longer can anybody enforce that. And I said, well, it's more than just whether you can enforce it or not. It's the principle of the matter. So I am glad to hear that you were saying there are some individual ways that you can work with this, because like I said, being a property owner, half of a property owner here for 44 years, it's important for me, just for the legacy for my children and grandchildren, that it goes on record that I'm not, living in a place where I saw it said no Jews, no Asians, no Blacks. It could have said Native Americans. I'm not sure. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And again, this is a good presentation. I'm just happy to see the work that you're doing at the University of Washington around this. And because I work with the School of Public Health, I'm on the board of the School of Public Health, and I represent them for the CDC. For community committees, I'm very interested in the public health impacts in the areas that you were mentioning. And we could see those 3 schools where there was just really blatant discrimination along with the public health. So carry on.
Yeah, no, it's a really, I'm glad you brought that up. I think, not from a project standpoint, but just from like a Jaslyn standpoint, I think that neighborhoods who were very known for restricting, they could do a much better job at the very least acknowledging that history of racial exclusion. And I think Wedgwood's one of the only neighborhoods in Seattle that have formally apologized for their use of racial restrictions. And I think that's a start that neighborhoods could take, or neighborhood associations from these very prevalent for using restrictions neighborhoods could take. And we hope with our project that academics and other people in fields like public health and education can use our work to kind of dig deeper into the ways in which these tools of segregation still continue to impact people in regards to public health and education.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And one other thing I wanted to just add, and I see my friend Dr. Amundsen is on board here too. He has led a group of us, a large group of us, who have been concerned about disproportionality in ticketing of Black citizens in the shoreline, and particularly the shoreline police department and residents in shoreline. And he uncovered a huge mass of certification and proof that disproportionately Black people driving while Black in shoreline have been stopped more than other people and ticketed more than other people. And it was brought to the attention of the mayor and the Shoreline City Council. And we haven't had a formal apology for that, but they did own the fact that they uncovered the information and told us that it was true. And it's not just us, it's Linwood, it's also down in Seattle, Des Moines, it's other places. But the point was, I just want to give Dr. Emerson a shout out, it was his work and tenacity that called this to my attention and the NAACP's attention and other citizens who care about how we are treated. Because I have sons who drive while Black here in this neighborhood. And although they haven't had the problem, doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. So thank you.
Yeah, so it looks like we have a few questions in the chat that I'll just bring up. So first, Pete was asking, how can an individual homeowner research their own historical restrictions? If any, are you referring to ones like if they're still on deed or if they were on the deed?
I think that's
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking deed, plat, and neighborhood.
Yeah, so the latter half of our project is devoted to reaching out to homeowners where we have found that we found a restriction for their house. And so one option you have, Pete, is you could wait, because our project ends in June. And so you could wait a few months and see if we contact you, because if we contact you, then you'll know that your property has a racial restriction in it. But in order to do this research, I think it'd be useful if you have that information from your title insurance company. I don't own a home, so it's kind of hard for me to explain it, but there's you need a parcel number and you need
Right.
that the kind of things that's on that title sheet, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. And I can also send a follow-up email that is a little more clear about some of the steps that you can take as well.
I've heard that there's 14 neighborhoods in Shoreline, and I've heard that every single one of them had restrictive covenants.
Yeah, I don't know that exact number, but that wouldn't surprise me. There is an abundance of racial restrictions in Shoreline. Any more questions?
Yeah, there are a few more in the chat. So Kevin is asking if there's a way to look up lands that were confiscated from Japanese Americans. Our project does not deal with that. I'm not aware of a place where you could look that up. There might be one, but I'm personally not. I don't know if Aaron and Jaslyn are.
Yeah, there may be, but our project isn't aware of one. Sorry, Kevin. Then this next question, are you aware of any private groups that attempt to direct school donations to the formerly redlined schools that get less private funding? No, we as a project aren't aware, because our project is only tasked with identifying and mapping the use of racial restrictive covenants in Washington State. These presentations we do and looking into education, public health, etc. That's kind of just to tie the presentations in. We don't spend much, if any, time at all going into the other sectors of the legacy of segregation, if that makes sense. So no, we haven't. Okay, is there any more questions before we move on to our Zooniverse transcription session? And if you end up having another question, that's fine. There'll be another time for questions after that next portion. Okay, but with that, I'm going to share my screen again.
Thank you all for your questions.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to, okay, take it away, Sam and Aaron.
All right, so now after we've answered a few questions, we are going to talk about Zooniverse, which is an online platform that allows people to get involved in real ongoing research, and what you guys will be using today to transcribe documents. So recently, we have developed a computer program that searches through the many thousands of digitized deed files to look for language matching racially restrictive covenants, and are currently using it to find restrictions in deeds. We are uploading the results to the program finds to Zooniverse. The program works very well, but it isn't perfect. So there can be false positives. For example, if a property owner with the last name White is in the document, the program can flag that because White is a racially charged word. And looking through these documents is very time consuming. So we are crowdsourcing the help. In a similar project in Minnesota called Mapping Prejudice, they were able to find over 30,000 restricted properties with the help of 6,000 volunteers. And we are hoping that with the help of community members, we can do something similar and be able to find restricted properties and transcribe the important information from them in a much more expeditious way.
Okay, so you will all be working with the actual website, but we're going to walk you through the steps here on PowerPoint. So firstly, we have put a link in the chat. I believe, Sam, did you drop that link just to make sure everyone has it?
I just did. So
okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam. Okay, so there is a link in the chat for our Zooniverse page. As we begin the Zooniverse tutorial, we would like you all to make an account with Zooniverse. So the process is very simple. You will just need to create a username and a password. After we finish the tutorial, Sam will then ask you all to use this username and password to sign in and begin transcribing. Here's what the Zooniverse page will look like when you first open it up, if you all want to take a look at the screen. And so once you scroll down the page a little, we can move to the next. Yeah, so once you scroll down the page a little, this is what it'll look like. So we have recently completed the King County module. So when working on Zooniverse today, you will all be working in the Snohomish module, which is the next batch of data that we need to look at. So the training module is only for practice, and no work that's done in this module is saved or counts toward the project. So now here's an example of what documents will look like on Zooniverse and how the software will ask you for information. So the general format is that the document you will be looking at is on the left side, and the instructions for what to do is going to be on the right side of the page. So the first question that is always asked when you get to a new document is, does this image contain a reference to a racial covenant? So the first thing you want to do here is read the document and see if it contains a racial restrictive covenant. If it does, you should select yes. If not, you should select no. You will automatically be sent to the second page, which is where our program will suggest that it suggests automatically that that's where the restriction should be. So don't look for the restriction on other pages of the document. You can toggle between 3 pages on the deed PDF. You may need other information that we will discuss shortly from the document that's on a different page. Deeds can be longer than 1 page, or there can be multiple located on the same page. You can identify where a new deed starts by decorative line breaks on the page, and or by looking for a record number in the left-hand margin. And again, this is a lot of information at one time. So during this tutorial, if you guys have any questions, or at the end, we will be happy to answer those for you. So the next question that Zooniverse will ask you to do is to transcribe the restrictive covenant exactly as you see it on the document. So you will move the restriction text that is closer to the input box by dragging and clicking. You can also zoom in. Another option is to open a text editing or word processing program, such as Word or Google Docs, whatever you like to use to type your documents. Sorry, light glitch. And you can type it up there and then copy it over to the Zooniverse entry box. So make sure to transcribe the entirety of the racial restriction. Usually this means one long sentence and exactly as it appears, even if it includes offensive language, which it most likely will. All right, so after you have identified the racial restriction and written
down what it says. Next question that Zooniverse asks is to locate the geographical information on the document and then record it. This information is usually near the beginning of a deed in one of the first paragraphs, as highlighted on the slide. Ideally, your document will only list 1 to 3 lots or tracts in a block in one edition. When this is the case, like it is in this example, you select the first option, 1 to 3 lots/tracts, blocks, editions. The plat or edition refers to how the neighborhood, more or less, was recorded with the county. Sometimes the word tract is used instead of lot. In this document, you would select that top option, 1 to 3 tracts/blocks, but there are other types of documents that you will likely encounter, which I will walk you through. All right, so sometimes a document with a restriction covers 4 or more lots and blocks, and sometimes even in multiple editions. When this is the case, it will be relatively clear, and you would select the second option. From there, Zooniverse will not ask you to transcribe that information, but it will rather flag it in our system so our research team can come back to it later. Right. Another type of document that you may come across is a very long geographical description with a bunch of numbers like longitude, latitude, all of that kind of stuff. This is pretty obvious when you see it, but sometimes the lot and block numbers are stated at the very end of the paragraph. So just make sure to double check because that makes it a lot easier for everyone. So yeah, just keep an eye out for that at the very end of that lengthy description. Once again, you won't need to transcribe this lengthy description. It will be flagged for our research team to come back to and deal with. There we go. There are also documents with restrictions that are for cemeteries and graves. When this is the geographical information listed, this is what it looks like. If you read this, if you see it's for a cemetery or a grave, you would select that option. All right, lastly, petitions are another type of document you may come across. If you see a long series of names and lot numbers in a bullet list style, this means it's probably a petition covenant. Petition covenants show up when a bunch of neighbors get together and decide they want to make their entire neighborhood off limits to specific racial groups. You will not be asked to inscribe this information. It will also be flagged for our research team to come back to. And I know that's a lot of different information. So if you're having a hard time remembering when you're doing this in the Zooniverse, you can just select need some help with this task. And it will show you examples similar to what I have showed you. Sorry, my sister is calling me. Oh my God. I'm so sorry about that. All right, so now, here's the page that would come up with the original document, that 1 to 3 tracts or lots number. When you select this option, Zooniverse will ask you to insert the lot or tract number, block number, and then edition name. If it's a lot and block situation, you will enter only numerical values for the lot and block, and then transcribe the name of the edition or plat. For example, West Haven Division number 2. If there are multiple lots listed, enter them separated by commas. If there is a partial lot, example, portion of lot X, just type in the number of the lot. If there is no block number, you can just leave that box blank.
Okay, so just to address the question in the chat, we can come back to it, but yes, high school students can help and receive volunteer service hours, and we can kind of go over that toward the end, which is an awesome opportunity for volunteers. So the next question that Zooniverse asks is, who is the seller of the restricted property? Sometimes this person is known as the grantor. Names of sellers, grantors, and buyers, grantees appear at the beginning of a deed, even before the geographic information. So enter the seller's full name as it appears on the page. And then, so Zooniverse will ask you who is buying the property, sometimes known as the grantee. Enter the buyer's full name as it appears on the page. If there are multiple buyers, you can just write the very first buyer listed, followed by et al. And now we are at the end of the classification process. So the last question that Zooniverse will ask you about the document is to record the date that the document was executed or recorded. You can use the drop-down menu to select the day, month, and year. Date of execution is usually in the first or last paragraph of the document. Sometimes it's hard to find, or there are multiple dates throughout the document. So if you're ever confused about what date you can use, just go ahead and use the filed for record date. And this is located at the very end of the document, right before the page break. So you can go ahead and hit the done button if you're all finished. And then you can also select done and talk if you have a question that you would like to submit the help board to the help board.
All right, so just a few reminders before we get into it. Make sure to look for restrictions only on the page that Zooniverse opens to. There are 3, but that first page, that's where the restriction will be that you need to record. Sometimes the end and beginning of a document is delineated by decorative lines. This was a way to save paper when it was a scarce resource when a lot of these deeds were being written. So just watch out for those and make sure all the info is from like one deed. And make sure to transcribe everything exactly as you see it, including offensive language and spelling errors. And lastly, if you make a mistake, you won't ruin the results. Each document is looked at by 5 different people to ensure accuracy and to make sure that like it's good. So one mistake is not going to ruin our project. So don't worry about that. All right, so please sign in, go to that link that I put in the chat. And we'll be here for a bit. So please, you can let us know if we have any questions. Feel free to just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. We'll be here.
Yes, and as you go along, like Sam said, if you have any questions, you can also like unmute yourself and share your screen. You can show us what you're looking at and we can walk you through it. And I'm sure that'll be helpful for everybody else too. And the reason, and the reason why the King County module isn't up there is because on Monday, the volunteers that we already have on Zooniverse, they finished it. So the timing for this presentation, it just didn't work out, unfortunately. But the Snohomish documents are really interesting as well. And Snohomish is, as you know, super close to Shoreline.
It's not asking for a sign-in.
On the when you click the link.
Yeah, I'm at the link in my browser.
I'm going to maybe I'll just go to Zooniverse and I'll show y'all how to sign in. That's what I'll do. Okay.
Do you have to sign in? It's not asking for that.
Yes, you have to sign in because if you don't sign in, it doesn't record your work. And so if this is the Zooniverse webpage, I'm going to sign out. But if you go to the top right corner, if you select registered, then I'll ask you to make an account really quick. And then once you make an account, you can start working and then it'll save your information. And as you all are transcribing, you can also use this time to ask any more questions you have as well, or comments.
This is Kenneth. I do have a question. When it asks you to transcribe, is it just the paragraph in which we have that language, or is it the entire page?
It's just that sentence that contains the restriction.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And that sometimes is the whole paragraph.
And again, just want to really emphasize the point that if you feel like you're not transcribing it correctly or you feel like it might be incorrect, that is okay. They're all going to be checked over 5 times. And then also our research team will double check it.
Okay, and so while you are transcribing, we're going to use this time to explain to y'all how you can help and how high school students can get involved.
Yeah, so, okay, if you are able, please help our project find and map these racial restrictive covenants through volunteering on Zooniverse whenever you are able. We always welcome and appreciate the help. So this work contributes to a really important public history project and will help us update our map of covenants on the Segregated Seattle website. Please, please, please spread the word. This is a great volunteer opportunity for students as well. We do sign off on volunteer hours. This is an asynchronous and fully remote volunteer opportunity, which I know is really appealing, especially in these times. And for students, it's nice to just be able to do something online and rack up those volunteer hours. So please send us an email at wawcovenants@gmail.com or visit our website to learn more about volunteering. And I believe Sam is going to drop a link to our newsletter. So you can go ahead and subscribe to that to keep up with any updates on the project as well.
And more info on how students can get involved, they can send us an email and let us know, so we can just be like on the lookout for their next email, so we can confirm their hours if they need us to do that for their organization or whatever. But if they just wanted to start getting start volunteering on Zooniverse by themselves, they could do that. And if they just send us a screenshot of the amount of classifications they've done, we could also verify hours that way as well. So they don't necessarily have to go through us.
Yeah, also, so I dropped a link to the newsletter, but first I dropped the link to our email, just if you want to like copy it and save it for later in the chat. And then I put our project website in the chat as well. And that last link I put in is the subscription to our newsletter. And answering Zachary's question, if Spokane County is on Zooniverse, then it's on Zooniverse right now. So you can go in and do those as well. We just said Snohomish because it's close to Shoreline, and King County's ended, but you can do any of those counties in Zooniverse are open for transcribing right now.